We open with the subtle distinction between leader development and leadership development. Leader development talks about the individual leader and expanding their capacity to be effective in the organization, whereas leadership development is really doing the same thing for the whole entire organization. So you could say doing or expanding the capacity of the entire set of leaders of an organization to lead the organization collectively. We're going to focus more on leader development as opposed to leadership development, but of course the two are intimately intertwined and interdependent on each other. Here's a neat little diagram that very succinctly summarizes the factors that either promote or deter learning through development methods. So we'll just go round robin here. Willingness to learn, I think it's fairly obvious. If you're not willing to learn as a leader, you're not going to learn. You have to be motivated and ready. And the problem with many leaders is because they're the leader, they feel like they got to a position because of their skills, and if they're doing well in the job, what's the need to learn? Okay, so maybe if you're in a crisis situation or in a downturn situation, your mentality might be different, but if you're not, then what's really your motivation to learn? And so that may be a factor. Hopefully, of course, the leader is motivated and ready to learn, and typically, again, this happens when there is either a crisis or something that's just not going right, where it's made salient to the leader that there is a need to pick up some additional skills. Opportunity to learn. Do we give leaders opportunities to learn through developmental experiences? But we're going to talk about what all those experiences are in this chapter here. But let me just be clear. You have to give people the time and the chance and the resources to actually do the learning, and that complements the motivation and the readiness. Culture will dictate what kinds of formal and informal support are available. We'll talk about what those methods are in just a second. And then experience with success, I was kind of getting at that before. If you're highly successful, again, you might be resistant or hesitant to learn. Although there are a minority of leaders who don't take that tack and say, you know what, I could have gotten lucky, or I can always learn more. But I will say that success or having success or lack of success is a major motivational determinant of willingness to learn. And then capacity to learn. Some people don't learn well. Even good leaders and top leaders, you would think they would learn well. Not necessarily. That's going to, and it's also subject dependent. So sometimes we can learn some things well and others not so well, depending on what it is that we're trying to learn. So there's a capacity issue that will inform our willingness and ability to learn. What is it that leaders learn when they're being developed? Well, here you have 5 bullet points that I think pretty succinctly summarize the different areas that leaders can be developed in. Basic knowledge is exactly what it sounds like. You're learning facts and figures and processes and knowledge that just helps you competently do the job as far as the cut and dried aspects of the job go. Personal growth and skill development kind of go together, and this is more about really being the leader that you need to be and getting the leadership skills that you need to have so that those around you perceive you to be an effective leader and that you are effectively an effective leader. Creativity. We don't often think of creativity as being something that can be trained or taught or learned, but it turns out a majority of the research says that it can be, even if you start out being an uncreative kind of a person, because that's just the way you've been your whole life. Some people like creativity, others don't like it or can't do it or haven't done it. And so, again, what we find is that creativity is teachable. At least certain aspects of it are. And so that can be a part of your development. Although typically it's not. I will say, when I've seen a lot of development programs being used on executives or used by executives, they don't tend to include a creativity component typically. The last piece is strategy. We train you to be strategic or increase your strategic skills, and that's just high-level thinking for visioning and revisioning a company's or an organization's plan about how to get where it wants to go. Here, once again, we have a neat little diagram that talks about the effectiveness criteria for training. That is, what is it that makes training effective? And it's, we often think about leadership effectiveness. Is the leader effective? Well, what about the training for the leader? If we're going to go through the motions of doing all the training that we want to do for our leaders and developing them, then we ought to be assessing whether the training itself is effective. So I'm not going to touch on each and every one here. I'm just going to call out the ones that I think are the most interesting and the least intuitive. I'll start with assessment, and that's exactly the point I was just making is, are we assessing your progress throughout the development? And that can happen a lot of different ways. This chapter talks about things like 360 evaluation and multi-method evaluation, so I'll get there pretty soon. But the point is, if you're not assessing your training efforts, then you're probably not you're probably less likely to achieve the goals you want to achieve through training than you are if you actually do the assessment. And sometimes that means that you're doing okay anyway. Sometimes it means that you're not picking up on the fact that the training is not working, if it's not working. Let me skip down to fit and integration with the organization. A lot of training out there is very generic, so companies and organizations can pay people to go outside the organization and be trained in a certain aspect of something. Let's say it's software, maybe. Nowadays there's a lot of software training. And the question you have to ask is, well, does that training actually fit with what we're trying to achieve here, or is it only tangentially related? And again, when you're buying generic training, you have to expect that there's not going to be 100% overlap, and you have to contend with that fact and make sure that there's not too much that is at variance with what you need. And that's a judgment call, and that's research that's going to be required, etc. So there's work there, but again, the better organizations are the ones that make sure or custom design their training to ensure that it's consistent with organizational needs. You'll see some of that in the book when we talk about, I think Goldman Sachs does it, and then a couple of companies who do their own MBAs and MPAs that are specifically tailored towards that particular organization. That's ideal if you can do that. But again, you have to pretty much have a big resource pot to draw on if you want to do things like that. Opportunity to practice is the next one I'll jump to. The next and final one I'll jump to, which you can learn any skill in the world. If you don't practice it long enough, it's not going to become part of your person, and it's not going to become part of your repertoire. As they say, the only way to get to Carnegie Hall is to practice, practice, practice. Well, the same thing for leadership. Really, development should happen as close to the field as possible, meaning in the typical work situations you find yourself in, because that's where it needs to be practiced and honed, and the leader himself or herself needs to be comfortable with the new ways of behaving. So that's what the practice does for you, of course. So we are now going to cycle through all the different methods of leader development, and I will just get right into it with the next slide. So I won't say much about self-awareness, because this is what you've been doing your whole entire time throughout the course, is by taking those personality inventories and leadership inventories as part of your self-assessment assignments. You've been hopefully generating a higher degree of self-awareness about yourself, just what it is that you're good at, just what it is that you need to improve at as far as your leadership qualities go. So this is a good starting point really for developing yourself and becoming a better leader. What you've been doing, of course, is bullet point 2 there, clarifying your own values and your own priorities, and then seeing how they might play out in different leadership situations. The theoretical knowledge that you now have from taking this course and looking at the different theories behind when leadership works and when it doesn't, or when leadership styles work and when they don't. You're now able to juxtapose your values and your priorities and your mindsets against the situational requirements that the contingency models would say dictate whether leadership is going to be effective or not. And you've also, of course, learned about your strengths and weaknesses, which again are not always strengths and weaknesses in the absolute sense. They are strengths and weaknesses with respect to leadership situations. That is the whole point we've been making in this course, although most people tend to want to improve upon their weaknesses in any sense, meaning they don't want to be weak in a certain leadership quality that may be required in a certain situation. For each of these tactics, we'll talk about whether how useful they are and whether there are other things that could be more useful. So we talk about this not being a rich experience or an opportunity to practice. And you can't practice self-awareness, meaning you can't do it in the field, whereas you can do other things like just having experience, and acts of leadership, of course, are field-based. So this is just more about knowing thyself, and then using that knowledge to see strategically how you could either improve or how you could be better in some situations than others. As the old saying goes, experience is often the best teacher. So this is a core part of any leader's development. The only problem really with experience, if you think about the pros and cons of all these different methods of development, is you can get lucky. This is Bill Gates' philosophy. He says success is a lousy teacher, meaning you can do something and it can seem like it's working and it may actually be working, but then circumstances change and the same behavior doesn't work. And that's the whole, again, the basis of this course is the contingency models that dictate when things will be effective and ineffective. So experience can solidify things in your mind that you're doing the right thing, but you may have a sampling issue where you haven't sampled enough different kinds of situations. Of course, the longer or the more experience you have, the more time you spend getting experience, the less likely that is to occur. But one of the things that the more removed methods do for you, like classroom training, like mentoring, coaching, etc., is they can get you to consider all these other situations and perspectives that your experience may not have led you into. So that, as I see it, is one of the only faults with the experience as a development method. But most people would tell you, and most pundits would tell you, and most academics would tell you that experience is the best way to learn how to lead. And it's the most stretching and broadening kind of a tool, as you see there in bullet point 3. The next two slides deal with coaching and mentoring. Let's briefly define and differentiate the two. Coaching refers to a learning process and a teaching process that is directed at enhancing certain specific skills. That's the key differentiator. Whereas mentoring is just more of a general support structure and learning structure that doesn't attempt to necessarily improve or hone certain skills, although indirectly it does. So executives are coached on things like how they relate to their stakeholders, their employees, to Wall Street, etc. But a mentor is somebody that you typically form a lifelong relationship with. And when I say lifelong, I typically mean the duration of your career in that particular organization. And they are a sounding board for all of your questions and concerns and needs. So that's really the difference. Both can be very, very useful. Both should be at certain times sought out. If we're talking about coaching, if we're talking about mentoring, it's also the case that you want to keep seeking out mentors because it's always better to have more rather than less, and you can always choose to cut back, and that's going to be a key point of the next slide. But typically, coaching, which sometimes you pay for, sometimes it's free, depending on the nature of the relationship, can be a very useful tool for getting specific things done and improved. So as promised, here's a slide on mentoring. Again, the difference is mentoring is more of a generalized process of feedback and learning as opposed to coaching, which is devoted to specific elements or specific tasks or needs. As I also mentioned in the last slide, you want to try to get as many different mentors as you can. Different perspectives are always good because You can see where there is consensus, and you can see where there is division on a given issue. And when there's consensus, well, typically that's easy to go along with if you think it's the right thing to do. And then when there's division, you need to understand the different viewpoints to make a better decision about whatever the issue is. The concept of anti-mentors, which is people who are typically bad at what they do. Can we learn from these people? People who are maybe incompetent or bad managers or bad leaders? Absolutely, you can. And everybody in their lifetime will be subject to anti-mentors. I guarantee it. You will have a bad boss. You will have a bad colleague. You will have a bad subordinate, etc. And so you can learn from them what not to do or how to do it better. You can see their failures play out, and you can take from that the lessons you need to do things the right way, whatever the right way happens to mean in your organization. Again, it's all organizationally dependent and situationally dependent. But again, you're looking at these sequences and saying, hey, you know what, that's not the way to do it. I think this would work better because I've seen it work better. So you can learn from anti-mentors. Okay. But again, typically what you're doing with mentoring is just getting a holistic picture of your abilities, your strengths and weaknesses, kind of like you're doing with the personality and leadership inventories. Just here you're having a person kind of view and observe your tendencies and tell you what they think relative to what they see in the organization. Feedback-intensive programs, which I'm not going to discuss at any great length, is something that may go by a different name in your organization, or whether you hire a firm to do it. There are firms that specialize in doing these kinds of things. What they are very intensive, as the name would imply, self-assessment sessions. So you could almost even consider this course to be a somewhat of a form of feedback-intensive program where you're doing these inventories every week and these leadership explorations on yourself. But companies will send executives and mid-level employees and sometimes even entry-level employees to a feedback-intensive program to learn very quickly what they're doing right and wrong, where they can improve. So it incorporates a lot of the elements we've already discussed. It just formalizes them a bit more and accelerates them into a jam-packed time frame, if you will. I think this is probably one of the most important slides because it talks about what's going to, I don't want to say guarantee, but promote success with these kinds of feedback programs and activities that we've talked about before. Number one is organizational buy-in. If the organization doesn't respect and encourage the training and the mentoring and the development, then of course it's not going to be useful for too long, and it may not even happen in the first place. Confidentiality is important because things are going to come out in these kinds of sessions and these kinds of conversations that are going to point to weaknesses in leaders, and they're going to cover some sensitive spots that leaders don't necessarily want exposed. So you have to worry about, you have to manage the confidentiality aspect, because again, you want people to expose their weaknesses so that you can deal with them, but if they're not willing to do so because they think there will be repercussions, then you have yourself a conflict with doing the development in the first place. So confidentiality has to be stated, it has to be managed, and there can't be any leaks, otherwise people will lose faith in the whole program. Obviously, a good facilitator who's well-trained and knows how to draw out these issues is needed. You want to focus on work-related or industry-relevant kinds of behaviors and issues. I think that one doesn't need explanation. Clear goals, same difference. Feedback not tied to respondents, that's a little difficult to imagine, not tying the feedback to the respondent. What I think we're trying to go for there is to just talk about some issues at a more general level sometimes versus being very specific about, well, this is what you need to do because you're weak in this particular area. Sometimes that's not the tack that you want to take. You want to phrase it more generally. But I generally tend to discourage that kind of feedback because it's not necessarily going to be as useful as saying, no, this is what you specifically need to work on because we've discovered this in the sessions. Follow-up, so we teach you things, we help you develop, we get you in a better position as a result of these sessions. And so therefore, do we leave it at that, or do we follow up in a few weeks and a few months to see if the changes have taken hold? Of course you want to follow up. If you don't follow up, it may all be for naught. You may have lost all the good work you did during these sessions. And last but not least, this is one tool in a toolbox of tools, so use multiple methods to the extent that you can, since they tend to be reinforcing of each other. Classroom education, much like what you are experiencing now, can be a good method, except that it's not field-driven, meaning you're learning it in an isolated environment. You're learning to develop yourself in ways that later need to be practiced. And so it's a good complement to field experience, but not necessarily a substitute for it. The best thing about classroom education is it does tend to be efficient, whereas experience development can take forever, or it can take a long, long time. Here you can get a lot of knowledge very, very quickly, hopefully, as you've done in this course. Outdoor challenges is something that seems really fun and entertaining, and it seems like it's going to teach you a lot, but the research does not confirm its usefulness. So I mention it just to kind of almost shoot it down a little, but I'm not saying that organizations shouldn't do these kinds of activities. I'm just saying they shouldn't bank on them as being the kinds of things that are necessarily going to move its leadership development forward. And so you know what these are, things like you go out into the middle of nature and you fall back into a group of people who are going to catch you, and you climb a tree together, and you do all these things that are kind of metaphors for building trust and getting to know each other. The problem is, again, when do we do this on the job? Never. When do we need to fall back into a bunch of people's arms, and when do we need to climb trees, and when do we need to build towers with straws? We don't. I mean, it's just kind of silly in some respects, even though there can be lessons learned from these activities about trust and dealing with your own emotions and working together as a group and getting a kind of a read on how people react to things. It's another reason why these challenges can be interesting. But again, the research does not confirm that these are in the long term going to be useful kinds of exercises for building leadership, just because of the context specificity problem, meaning that the contexts are different between being outside and being doing work in an organization whose mission has nothing to do with the outdoor activities. This slide is actually jam-packed with some information about how leader development is going to be perceived differently by different cultures, and I'm going to let you read the textbook on this one because there's just too much going on here. But it's going to relate back to a lot of the things we've already talked about. These should look familiar to you, things like individualism, collectivism, tolerance of ambiguity or uncertainty, really, they go together. Time styles and time perceptions and power distance. All these we talked about with Hofstede and Globe. And they're going to dictate, again, just how receptive your people are to being trained and developed. And what you'll learn pretty quickly is that there's differences between cultures. Okay, some cultures are really not that receptive to it, or at least not as much as other cultures are, and they are dictated, or rather the receptivity is dictated by these factors and some more even. And so we end the chapter and the course with this final slide on factors in successful development. Three main things you have to have in order to have successful development in general. One is somebody who wants to be developed, so the personal commitment and growth to development. That's just not just going to the sessions and learning or the classroom and learning or just talking to the mentor and learning. It's taking that information and then using it in the field, in practice, over time, and then gauging how well it's going with the help of others. Organizational commitment and resources. Again, if the organization doesn't want to develop its people, and there are plenty of organizations that don't, just because they don't have the resources or the time or the energy or the money or the know-how or the desire, if you will. So again, this is part and parcel of what the organization wants to accomplish and how it values the leadership development function. The last piece is the fit between person and organization, which dictates a lot of outcomes, not just successful development, but also just how well you lead and how well you get along with others, which is a big part of leading. So we have come to the end. I want to congratulate you for braving through all of these PowerPoints. It's been a long haul, but you've done it, and I look forward to seeing your final submissions online. Congratulations, and best of luck with future endeavors.